welcome everybody, all our participants. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. So I want, as usual, to present our lecturers. But first, I would like to remind you that our webinars are around 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open to the questions. And you can write us the question in the chat, or you can raise your digital hand, and I will open your microphone. So let me introduce to you Moshe Sluhovsky. He is Paulette and Claude Kelman Chair in the Study of French Jews at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and Professor of History at the Hebrew University. And Eva Illouz, she is a sociologist of culture and emotions, and author of 13 books translated in more than 23 languages. So please, the floor is yours, and we're going to listen your conversation very carefully. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Moshe.
Hi, Eva. Good to see you. Why don't you start?
I thought you were going to start, but if you don't, I'm happy to start. I was, given that the title of this discussion is I think the title was A Few Thoughts on an Unprecedented Crisis. So I was trying to figure out to myself, why did I give that name and why unprecedented mostly, I think. We have the intuition that this is something new, and yet I wasn't quite able to know if the novelty of it was a result of my historical ignorance, or if there indeed was something completely new to it. So I'm just going to talk a little bit from the top of my head and say that when I try to understand why it felt so unprecedented, I think the first thing that all of us would agree on is the fact that at some point, I think it was maybe in May or something like that, I think that we were 5 billion people who had actually stopped all activities and all socializing, all mobility, for many of us, all work. And so the first thing that for me is absolutely striking, not only striking, but literally, I think, created a state of stupor that many of us, took a long time to come out of, was that it was both a planetary event, but an event of immobility. And that, I think, is really new. I mean, I'm not a historian of epidemics or pandemics, but I think that, if we look at even the Spanish flu, which was far more deadly than ours, since it contaminated, I think, 500 million people and killed about 50 million people. The Spanish flu, which lasted 4 years, there was nothing like a national lockdown, and let alone a planetary one. This is really, I think, a novelty of this crisis. I think there were cities that imposed a national lockdown, a local lockdown, particular cities, but there was not this notion of national lockdown. And even in the Ebola outbreaks that were in 2014 and 15, I think that only Sierra Leone had enforced a national lockdown, and I think it lasted only for 3 days. From, if I remember correctly, something I read. So that, I think, for me was truly stupefying. And I think it is also historically stupefying. So I think my sense that this is unprecedented is warranted. Secondly, if you had asked me 2 days before if it was likely to see the gigantic wheels of capitalism stop, at least of a certain capitalism, manufacture, industrial capitalism, leisure, the cultural industries, I would have answered you like Zizek. I would have said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. It would have been unthinkable. And yet what we did was to, at least in Europe, and I think, Moshe, you want to focus or think about the differences maybe between Europe and the United States. But what was really surprising was how easily, and especially also in Israel, I have to say, how easily it was to stop all economic activities, but completely stopped. I mean, small commerce collapsed, and an enormous industry like the tourism industry, which is absolutely crucial to Israel economic health, went to a complete halt. Now, that's stunning when you think of it, because again, if I have to think about the Hong Kong epidemic, I think it was in 1968, 1969, if I'm not wrong. But I mean, it was in the 1960s for sure. So it's not such a long time ago. There was, again, nobody thought even of stopping the economy. So that, again, it completely changes what I had thought about the power of capitalism. In a way, it really suggests that there is, what I would call a sanitary reason, that is a sanitary reason that prevailed over the economic reason, that is this idea that the health of citizens, that the state views itself, at least for this crisis, it viewed itself as much more responsible, or as extremely responsible for the health of its citizens, in a way that I did not suspect. That is, in a way that was able to almost overcome the economic reason. And the third thing that really surprised me, that came later. So this, I'm talking about my stupor at the beginning. I think that what came later that really surprised me, and that I absolutely did not expect, was one, the enormous differences between Europe and the United States. But I don't know if I should make too much out of it, given that the United States were governed by someone who is extremely unusual in its history and with regard even, to world democracies. So, but mostly what really surprised me was how quickly political lines of fracture got organized around the question of the lockdowns and the sanitary policy. I mean, you can of course expect things to be contested, but what I did not expect was to see for example, the extreme right in Europe, or fractions of the extremely right, like UKIP, Farage, or the AfD in Germany, actually make out of the sanitary crisis really a new battle horse. We can, I think, also talk about this if you want. So, this is so if I had to think about what is unprecedented for me in this crisis, these would be the three elements. That the fact that the planetary lockdown, the fact that capitalism seems to have been subsumed under what I call the sanitary reason, and three, that new lines of political this differentiation emerged, and very strangely. I mean, we can talk about this also later. Arguments which would have been made by the right 20 years ago were actually completely made by the left. That is, first of all, think about our security and believe in science. So so you had a very ironic inversion of political identities also that happened with which I found also extremely interesting. So Moshe, you tell me what you think.
Thank you. I think it was a wonderful opening statement, because I agree with everything you said, but you also put it very nicely when you say, for example, planetary event of immobility. I think it captures it really beautifully. I agree with what you're saying about the unprecedented scale of all of it. And I definitely agree with what you're saying about capitalism. Who could have imagined capitalism, specific manufacturing, tourism stopping? Somebody just hit the brakes and everything shut down. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the world shut down. It is global, but it's also extremely personal for each and every individual. So it really is unprecedented. I will add that it comes on top of 30, 40, 50 years of intense acceleration of everything. We've gotten so used to the economy working faster, to information moving faster, to shopping, travel, even dating, the topic about which you have written so much. Everything is happening so much faster, and then suddenly everything comes to a halt. So I think part of the part of the awe in which all of us experience it was this tension, this contradiction between the way we have gotten so used to what suddenly happened to all of us. So this is one thing that I would like to, that I think that has impressed me or shocked me a lot. Two is indeed, as you say, about capitalism. And the ability, we have gotten used to thinking in terms of global economy and companies that are larger than states, or that the interests of capitalism can dictate policies to states. And here we have this voluntary surrender of citizens to the wishes of the states to block capitalism, to block commerce, to put everything on hold. And I think this play between the individual, the state, and the market is being reshaped maybe right now in ways that we are not really capable of thinking about or measuring, because we are still in the process of all of this thing happening. Third point, to follow up on what you said again about the left and the right, the political dimension of it, and I think is absolutely, again, fascinating. You put it nicely about the things that the right used to stand for, science and security, and now what the left stands for. I think that when we look at political elites and the involvement of political elites in all of this, it is striking that the US, of course, but also Brazil, that is a huge pharmacological industry, if the highest number of deaths, not in absolute numbers, but compared to the size of the population, which makes absolutely no sense unless we think about it within a context of politics, decision-making processes, and the fact that these two states are ruled by rulers in which, or for whom, distrust of science has become crucial for the self-identity of the regime. And I'm using this language because I want to connect it to the next huge natural disaster. This is just around the corner, which is, of course, global warming and climate change. And I think these two heads of states, Bolsonaro and Trump, put the fight against the scientific belief in global warming is a core of their political agenda, and therefore I think it also led them to a dismissal, distrust of science within the context of how to fight COVID.
So can I say something here? Because I think you said something very crucial. You know, your comparison between Brazil and the United States, you know Brazil much more than I do. It strikes me, though, that Bolsonaro and Trump have a very similar. They're both rather ruthless and brutal leaders, and we may contrast them with they are not only neoliberal, but we may contrast, they are also hyper masculinist. I mean, Bolsonaro is the one who said he preferred his son to die than to be a gay man. And we know that Trump also refused to wear a mask because it would make him appear weak. So they both connect to a kind of hyper masculinity or toxic masculinity that, in my opinion, is deeply connected also to their spectacular mismanagement of the sanitary crisis, to be contrasted with the ways in which New Zealand head of state and many women around the world actually conducted this out of a kind of ethics of care. But I wanted to also go back to what you said about science. These people, I think, distrust science, and we have seen what I would call an epistemological crisis at the very center of the pandemic, in the same way that we're witnessing an epistemological crisis with regard to climate change. That is, what we are witnessing is the inability for people to agree on truth. And here, so I think what is happening in the case of Bolsonaro and Trump, for example, first of all, I think they're riding on 10 or 20 years of very massive campaigning against climate change by some, lobbies like the Koch brothers, etc., who invested a lot of money denying climate change. And that means also politicizing climate change. And therefore, the way they did it was by politicizing science itself. That, I think, is a very interesting and extremely worrisome phenomenon that has happened in the last 20 years. And the pandemic, in fact, latched itself on this crisis of truth and knowledge of the last 20 years, which was, by the way, I think also very much fed by the left and the postmodern left, what I would call, but that's another issue. And finally, I would say that people like Trump and Bolsonaro cannot stand science and expertise, because for those of us who believe in science and expertise, we know that, in fact, the expert is the ultimate authority. And they simply have a personality. We know that the personality of the dictator is exactly characterized by his ability to dictate the truth. I think it was, I don't know, I think it was Orwell. Yeah, Orwell, I think, who said that what makes a dictator, it's his ability to say 2 and 2 are 5. And to make it into five. And that's how you are a dictator, in fact. So the denial of truth is quite important to the exercise of tyrannical power. And so that's I think the reason why we had such a spectacular denial of science during this pandemic, and rife with how do you say in English, complotisme, complotisme, conspiracy theories. I think this is why also, because science simply didn't play, I mean, for some people, for a certain group of people, science did not play a significant role at all.
Yeah, I agree. I find it all very persuasive, and I agree. I also think that it's an important point you're making when you're saying it exposes processes that have been in the making over 20 or 30 years. I think the distrust of elites, the politicization of science that you're pointing out is absolutely true. And I've been experiencing most of the pandemic from New York. I'm on sabbatical. And I think there is a big difference between experiencing it in Israel before I came here and experiencing it here. I think what has become a crucial aspect of it here is this distrust of elites, political, scientific, and which somehow, and I think I'm not a professor of American politics to analyze it thoroughly, but there is some connection between red and blue states and wearing and not wearing masks, hostility to elites that are on the coast, but I'm here in New York where everybody is masked non-stop. You don't see a person without a mask on the streets or indoors. While I read about, I'm not there, that mayors, governors of what is called red states being threatened for imposing masks or trying to impose masks. And I think only this morning I read in the newspaper that the mayor of a small town in Kansas decided to resign a job because she tried to impose mask mandate on a small town, and the responses were so violent that she doesn't want to take the risk. So there is a connection, I think, between distrusting elites, distrusting science, maybe feeling marginalized, and all of this, I think, are processes that have started long ago and that the pandemic exposed in ways that I think we have not expected.
So, I mean, you are completely right. I mean, have you heard about the Hold Up movie in France? It's a movie that received an enormous amount of success, and it was shown on YouTube mostly, and it claims that the pandemic is the result of a world elite conspiracy. And so I think, in fact, what is, I would add this maybe, if I had to say the fourth element or fifth element after what you said about what makes this crisis fairly unprecedented, to build on what you just said, is the fact that it resonated with the populist turn which so many countries have taken, when we know that what characterizes the current wave of populism is its deep distrust of elites. And I think it has a different inflection depending on the country, but these can be economic elites or cultural elites, or what I did not know, and this is what the pandemic clarified, is that it included as well scientific elites. So in France, for example, you had something the French public never saw before. You had a huge debate between scientist Raoult from Marseille, who promoted the hydrochloroquine, and a part of the scientific establishment which did not recognize it. And what was quite amazing was how much Raoult, managed to mobilize a part of French public opinion as if he was representing, in a way, their own distrust and mistrust of the establishment. And so I think for the first time, really, French people could see scientists disagreeing between themselves in such a theatrical way, almost. So I mean, just to complete your own thought, I think the distrust we have witnessed of experts resonates very much with the current wave of populism, which is exactly characterized by a deep distrust of elites. Only that, the scientific elites are also mistrusted. I think this is what we found out.
I want to add one thing that I think is controversial, even in my own mind. And I'm going to say it in a provocative manner. I think that another interesting thing that I've noticed, and I'm thinking again comparatively, is the willingness of people in most countries in the world to sacrifice for the well-being of other people, whether it's young people not going to work, losing economically to protect elderly people, whether it's everybody wearing masks, as opposed to a language that, again, I think to a very large degree is unique to the US, that says my liberty, my freedom comes first. And I'll say it provocatively, I don't care if I kill my neighbor or my grandparents. It's more important for me to make a political statement that no one has the right to tell me whether to wear a mask or not to wear a mask.
So I'm sorry, Moshe, you're talking now about, which are these people that you're talking about?
I'm talking about many people in the United States for whom not wearing a mask and putting other people at risk became a political issue. And I think it's uniquely American, and I have not heard echoes of it in other countries. It says, I think, something fundamental and very distressing about American, by American I mean US, society or politics at this specific moment. But I also want us to remember the other side of it. The other side of it is the willingness of so many people all over the world to sacrifice for the benefit of other people. And I think the one place in which it is maybe the most pronounced is the demands on young people and younger people who are the least likely to get seriously infected, to stay home, to lose income, to lose their jobs, in order to make it safer for older people.
So I want to say something about what you just said. I think it's very interesting, and it is a development of this, this idea I suggested at the beginning about how the economic reason has been defeated in a way by the sanitary reason. So you're developing it. So it's really surprising in light, especially of the fact that many societies, couldn't tell you how many, but many traditional societies practice semicide. That is, they kill their old people, and they kill their old people, especially, if you're nomad, for example, and you live in a society where resources are scarce, it is fairly well accepted to kill find ways to kill the old people, those who have had the bad taste of remaining alive for a long time. So it really shows what you just said, really shows a kind of civilizational shift, precisely what you said. The fact that the young and in fact the entire society would be willing to come to a halt for the vulnerable and for the older people. I want to say, though, that some people have very much taken, have very much argued with this view. And I've seen, I mean, from people who claim, I'm saying this from people who claim to be moral themselves, not from people like Trump. So one, for example, is Agamben, who views the reduction of freedom as politically extremely dangerous. That was one line of argument. But the second is a philosopher, for example, a French philosopher called André Comte Sponville, who excoriated this idea, what he called healthism, in French, healthism, the cult of health. And he offered the very provocative idea that there is a hierarchy of death. And he said, to die at the age of 15 is not the same as dying at the age of 70 or 80. We are preventing these young people from living. Therefore, he said, I'm willing myself to take the risk of dying because there is a hierarchy of death. And we have forgotten that there is a hierarchy of death. I'm not saying what I think. I'm just saying this is an interesting argument that we should also think about. And finally, what you said about those Americans who refuse to wear a mask. So first of all, my hunch is that these are the same people who are in favor of having guns. I'm pretty sure there would be a very high overlap between the two. But I think more deeply it comes from a completely and almost fundamentally different way of understanding the social contract in the United States and in Europe. And so I think in the United States, let's not forget that there has been traditionally high suspicion of government. And there is, especially I would say in many red states, there is a very strong libertarian tradition. People believe that the first and last good that the government should defend is their freedom. That the role of government is to be there only so that they, as individuals, can be free. More fundamentally, it shows in a way the collapse. I mean, l'échec, the failure of a certain model, which precisely is so concentrated on ensuring individual freedom and does not put emphasis, as Germany or France certainly do, on a Rousseau vision of a social contract. I mean, this idea that there is a collective good to defend. And that I don't think we have ever seen the failure, for me, I'm talking about myself, the failure of the American political model and social contract as clearly and crisply as during this pandemic.
I totally agree. I think that we have seen in this country, again, I mean the US, it's not that we've seen it, it has exposed a pre-existing process in which the social contract is disintegrating. And I think it accelerated the process. We don't know where it's heading, where it's gonna take us. I also think that it resonates. I remember that with the AIDS crisis too in France, we heard this anti-healthism argument. So there is something interesting there to think about the tradition of French discourse of anti-healthism. I like the term that you just used, and that's probably also a place in which voices from radical right and voices from radical left meet, and therefore we saw some demonstrations in European cities in which people from the libertarian radical left and people from the extreme right demonstrated together with the anti-virus people and with the right-wing extremism in demonstrations against governments that impose this or that sanitary policy. I think we've covered a lot. Maybe we should let people from the audience ask questions.
I mean, there is someone who seems to be extremely eager to express himself, Mr. Oscar. So, please.
Yes, and also we have already some questions. Mr. Oscar, if you want to raise your hand so I can allow you to speak. Okay. Please, you can open your microphone now.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. But I can't see you. Anyway. Now, the matter is very complicated, and I am afraid you are considering things only from one direction. And I would not like, first of all, to mix the pandemic with the climate change. There is no denial there is a climate change, but remains to be seen whether we can do something about it. This is the first thing. The second thing is, let's not confuse pollution with climate change, which many people do. By the way, a few months ago, in a webinar organized by the Hebrew University, the climate expert of the Hebrew University, to my question whether the climate science, which is a rather new science, is capable of predicting that it is the fault of man, and he simply said, I don't know. The only thing is that the temperature is rising. Why is this happening? Exactly. It's very difficult, and it can be divided. Then regarding the pandemic, first of all, there have been, with some rare exceptions, like New Zealand and Taiwan, and to some extent Australia, and I am talking about Australia from first-hand information because my daughter lives in Melbourne. With these exceptions, Australia had some problems too. New Zealand, we cannot take New Zealand as an example. It is a small country at the end of the world, the island, absolutely isolated, so they were able to take some measures which other countries cannot. What has happened? First of all, I do not think you can distinguish between the red states and blue states, because the number of casualties in New York, which is a very blue state, were extremely high, while in other states it was much lower. The issue is much more complicated. There have been governments which at the beginning were able to tackle the pandemic and after that failed. Germany started well, now it is deep in trouble. Sweden had a certain approach, it is in trouble now. South Korea, which was extremely well coping with it, now they are in trouble. Japan is in trouble. Only Taiwan, which is a real exception, is still handling well. The issue is that basically no governments were able to handle the pandemic properly.
I think we should let Eva and Moshe to answer now.
Okay, thank you. These were two big questions, and I will not go into all of the aspects of them just because they're huge. In terms of the climate change and the ability or inability to make changes. I think that there is an extremely wide consensus among scientists and governments that there is quite a lot that humans and governments can do about it. And I think that that the US will probably join this consensus within exactly 1 month. So I think that both Eva and I here represent the scientific and as well as the political consensus, which of course not to say that in the margins there are people who believe in all kinds of alternative theories and explanation of historical, political, global, geographical processes, and it's good to have some other voices heard. In terms of the numbers of casualty and the ways in which different countries have tackled the pandemic, and you mentioned New York and the number of deaths in New York. I think that we have to make a very important distinction between two things. One is number per number of inhabitants, and then when did it hit? When it hit New York, people didn't really know how to deal with it. When it hits North Dakota, 6 or 7 months later, every death in North Dakota was unnecessary death, and a death that is due to a political leader making the wrong decisions, whether it's the governor of North Dakota or South Dakota, and whether it is the president of the United States. The deaths at the beginning belonged to one category. The deaths that people are experiencing now in the Midwest belong to a completely different category. The current category is category of unnecessary deaths that are due to the president and his cronies refusing to impose the right politics. And if you talk about Germany and what is happening in Germany, yes, Germany is now experiencing lockdown and high numbers. These are high numbers compared to what the Germans have gotten used to over the last 8 months. In terms of deaths per population, there is absolutely no comparison between the high number of deaths in the US to any other country.
I'll just say it'll be extremely short. Thank you so much, Moshe. Mr. Oscar, I think we are speaking or talking to each other at cross purposes. And I really appreciate that you disagree. You seem to be insisting on that. No one is denying that the crisis is very complicated and that the virus has a logic of its own that governments and states, however efficient they try to be, cannot overcome. The point was to say that within this crisis, we have seen many political we have seen how political institutions and how certain political crises also got expressed. Crises have their own ways of putting to the fore what doesn't work or what was only latently not working in a society. But it's the same with couples. If you don't have a crisis, a huge crisis, couples can bear each other's presence with manners and etiquette. But when a crisis emerges, then everything that is wrong between them becomes even more wrong. So it is not uninteresting to try and think about the ways in which this crisis is dealt with differently in different countries. That was exactly the purpose of our talk, to try and clarify how the crisis actually has put forward some aspects and dimensions of American culture, political culture, and institutions.
Thank you. We have a question from Melanie Aaron. I think maybe it's better if you will also open your microphone. Melanie, would you like to do so? Or otherwise, I will just read your question. Okay, so so I'll read her question. Can you read it too in the question and answer session?
No, I don't see.
No, you don't see it. Okay.
No.
Can't. Okay, Melanie, you should raise your digital hand so I can open your microphone. Okay, here she is. So now you can open your microphone.
So I appreciated the comment about a relationship between the gun issues and the liberty issues. But I had two follow-up questions. One is, can something be done to raise the commitment to communal solidarity and caring, which does not seem to be strong in the United States? And then another question relates to these anti-maskers and liberty people. Do they really represent the future for the United States, or are they part of that element of the past that is trying to cling to power in the face of the changing demographics of our country?
Eva?
No, Moshe, you're the one who represents the United States tonight. You go first.
Melanie, thanks for the question, but it sounds like from your accent, it sounds like you're the American one. I'm not, and Eva is not. I mean, yeah, I'm a citizen, but I'm not. I don't think of myself as an American. As a visitor to this great country, I think you're in trouble. Not you personally, but your political social contract and environment. I'm a historian, I'm not a prophet. I don't know where it's heading, but there is a sense of, but coming in as a visitor over many, many years now, there is a sense of a radicalization and growing distance between two parts of the country, between the coast and the center, between the educated and the less educated, between races. And when I put all of this together, I'm pessimistic. I'm even very pessimistic. I have friends who are professors of American politics whom I've been talking to a lot recently, and some of them even speak the language of a civil war or violence. But I really am not. I'm really not an expert, and I'm really a guest, and a guest should not insult the hosts.
Well, first of all, I have to say, I'm not very good answering two types of questions. Can something be done? What should be done? And what will be in the future? And these are your two questions, Mrs. Aaron. Although, you know, of course, they are very important questions. Let me just say, I mean, of course, I'm sure there is something to be done, although I think that the libertarian tradition in the United States is extremely strong, especially in the red states. And I say this with the utmost respect. I think, and by the way, these are communities that are quite often very caring to each other. These people live often in very caring communities. So this is not to say by any means that these people don't care about other people at all. Now, with regard to the anti-mask people, the problem is that, I mean, you said, well, these people are on their way out of, I presume you mean to say they're on their way out of the stage of history. I'm not sure, because we know that the Republicans today are actually a minority party. But the institutions enable the minority party to control the rest. And that might be the reason why Moshe mentioned his friends who fear violence, because in a way, this goes back to the situation from which America emerged against England, because at some point they understood they were the majority, they were ruled by a minority. And so, and Republicans are doing everything they can to exploit all the loopholes within the American institution in order to grab onto power. And what is quite stunning is, after the enormous disaster of, the handling of the crisis, still Biden's victory is razor thin. And it was rather thin, I think, because of the electoral system that the United States has. And there is no way, in my opinion, that the small states are going to agree to change the constitution, because this would require a change of constitution. So whether or not they are on their way out demographically, yes, that might be, but their hold on the institutions is tremendous. And they can wreak tremendous havoc on those institutions, as we have seen. So I'm not sure exactly if we should be reassured by the demography and I'm not sure at all.
Well, I want to take it back to something that Eva mentioned earlier, and I will reintroduce the notion of gender into our discussion. And Eva talked about toxic masculinity and hypermasculinity, and I think you really should not for a minute ignore the terrible role it has played in this pandemic. And I think that we see it in every statistics and in every discussion, the willingness of more women than men to wear masks, the sad fact that in so many places across the globe, the pandemic exposed the degree to which the home, which is supposed to be the safe space, in a time of crisis, is not a safe space, and that there's been in many places an increase in violence, spousal violence against women within the private domestic sphere. So I think that when we're talking about the divisions or societal divisions that have been exposed in the last 6 or 8 months, I think this is another one that we have to think about, and what are its implications, and what does it tell us about a future or possible futures, this combination, whether it's gun, mask, violence, hypermasculinity, what are the settings in which all of these things are going to shape and influence each other in all sorts of ways that we cannot even imagine, but that I cannot imagine it being nice ways. I think that any combination, I think, is going to be dangerous.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we have time for a few more questions, but I don't see any, so we can wait and see if someone wants to raise the digital hand. I think the best is to open the microphone, so the question will be more direct. Here we have, okay. Mr. De Maria, you can open your microphone now. Yeah, you can speak.
Good evening, and thank you for your lecture. I want to ask two things. The one was about the fact that despite the good level of pharmacy industries in the States, in the US, and in Brazil, many deaths occurred. Many people died. Does this can have something to do with the fact that only some people can afford medical treatment and the poorest not? And so as the pandemic involves all the people, if a part of the population cannot be cured, the entire population suffers. And do you think it will lead to some changes or not? Maybe the policy of Obama of public health care can be reintroduced or not. And the other was about the fact that the crisis of truth, that we see a good number of people even believing to strange ideas, completely unscientific, that they read on Facebook or on that. And which is, in your opinion, the reason for this so lower faith in truth? Thank you.
So I think your first question was a question really for doctors. The question which was, do people die because they don't have access to medicine? Of course, it's a, we would need to know actually how many people did not or could have been cured, and how, I mean, first of all, how much we can be cured. It could be that in many cases we can't, and I don't know actually how many could not get treatment in the United States. Maybe Moshe knows this number. Moshe, do you know actually how many people actually died because they could not go? I mean, we don't know if they would have died at home or in the hospital. That's what I'm saying.
No, I assume in the US, everybody can have access to some level of healthcare. It's not what Giuliani got last week when he got infected, but I assume that it's much more difficult in the hinterland of Brazil to get access to a good clinic. But of course, it also, as Eva points out, it also depends on the availability of know-how, and later now when we know more about it, of machines and breathing equipment and so on and so forth. So I don't think we can know this kind of statistic until way 2 or 3 years down the road. But this in and of itself is not a justification, because the death rate was extremely high, even in a big city like Sao Paulo. And again, later, not unlike New York when it was very early on. In Sao Paulo, there was no justification for it by the time the death wave hit. Sorry, I've interrupted you.
Yeah, so no, just to thank you, Moshe. I just wanted to say, with regard to the question about their social class, I'm sure it plays a role. And we know, I mean, that I read about the Spanish flu, that one of the reasons we think today, one of the reasons why that flu was so deadly was because people were extremely weakened. Their immune system had been extremely weakened by the war, and that many people had suffered from famine. And so hunger, malnutrition, extreme tiredness were enormous contributing factors and explain the 50 million who died. And so that is in turn just a way for me to say, I am sure it's connected to social class, if only because in certain places, what we call the essentials, the people who did the essential work, were for the most part on the front line and were working class people. But also it could be that their way of eating and their way of living makes them more prone to having a weak immune system. And then your second question, I'm sorry, your second remark was?
Conspiracy.
Conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories, I think you're right. It's an extremely important phenomenon, which is not in itself that new. Jews know something, alas, about it. 19th century protocol of the Elders of Zion was an enormous conspiracy theory. So one theory for the extraordinary flourishing of this way of thinking, according to some sociologists, it has to do with the fact that modern forms of power are far away and impersonal. So there arises a kind of anxiety or question about who governs actually. And so there is this view that modernity is about the question of who governs us, given that it's quite far. Second, if you look at the politics, I mean, the politics of the last 30 years, or, since Nixon, I would say since Nixon, I think, was a watershed. We have become quite accustomed to the idea that democracy is a sham. It is a theater. Democracy, we have become to this idea that that real power is actually exercised far away from the limelight, that power is not transparent, it only pretends to be transparent, and that it hides many interests. I think it has to do also a lot with an increasing presence of money and capital and lobbies inside politics, not only in the United States, but worldwide. And this has made citizens extremely suspicious. Finally, I would say that conspiracy theories are a form of intelligence of the poor, because when I believe I'm being manipulated and I go around promoting that idea, in fact, what I'm trying to do is show to myself and my circle of friends how smart I am. So it's a form of smartness. Paradoxically, I think it's a way of saying I am a good citizen who is able to decipher the intrigues of power. So if you want, for me, I mean, I view that as a disease of democracy. It's a very specific disease of democracy. And finally, you said it yourself, sir, the social media, which contribute which function as echo chambers of information, where people recycle their own opinions and become more and more hermetic to competing information. So we can even now look at the era where we could watch TV news with nostalgia, as an era in which we still shared a symbolic world in common. And we are increasingly not sharing that world anymore, and with very little competing information to intrude on the world we create through social media.
Eva, you put it beautifully. I will add, though, that we should not forget that the social media started as, and it still is, a big democratizing venue. It is enabling more and more people to shape what established media has been telling them. The question is, how do we create some mechanisms that prevent the harmful impact of it from the extremely positive democratizing aspects of it? And I think here, again, due to political circumstances, we're heading in the wrong direction, because conspiracy theories were, to a very large degree, more widespread, and Eva put it nicely before, of poorer countries, of countries in which, like I think of Pakistan, for example, countries in which you know that you cannot trust the elites, you cannot trust the regime, and you cannot trust everything that the regime is telling you. What I find unique in the last year or so is that you have people from within the very center of power in the US government spreading conspiracy theories about the US government. And I think this is unprecedented. So if I'm the citizen who is listening, I cannot but be completely confused about who is telling the truth and who is not, because I have my own president who tells me, go and drink, I don't remember what it was anymore, and it will drink bleach and it will heal you. So whom do I trust? A bureaucrat?
Get an injection of bleach.
Sorry?
Get an injection of bleach.
Yeah, get an injection of bleach. So whom should I trust and why? And what is a more valid and less valid source of information? So I think what I want to say is that things that used to be in the fringes and the margins are now being articulated at the very center of power. I think that we in the US just elected one and maybe two Congress, I think women, both of them, who believe in the QAnon. So the boundary between truth and scientific truth and conspiracy and even straight up lies have been blurred in unprecedented ways by elites.
Thank you, Moshe. I think we can have you the last word.
Yes, I thank you. Thank you, Moshe, and thank you, Eva. I think this was the last word, and thank you for sharing with us your points of view on this incredible pandemic time. It was really, really interesting to hear you, and both geographically are in two different places, and also you explained us the two different points of view. So thank you a lot. Thank you to all the participants. I'll wait for you in the next webinar next week. You will receive the recording of this webinar in the next days. And thank you, Eva, and thank you, Moshe, for
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.